Hey everybody at Hill City, I'm Philip Thomas. I am the youth pastor for our church, so a lot of you guys know me. I'm going to be talking about suffering and patience today, which is, for some of you, I think you understand why I'm giving that lesson, just with the past experiences that I've had. And John and I talked about this a little bit. I'm really excited to discuss it and kind of my journey and how to view this biblically and really from God's perspective. Because a lot of times we go through things that we just don't understand. And I hope that through my story, it helps those that are suffering, those that are coping with things that have happened in their lives that have been crazy. I hope it helps people cope with COVID and just all the things we've been through over the last 2 years, and really just brings us together in this concept that we can honor God with our suffering and through our patience. So I'm just going to get right into this today because it's a tough story to tell, but it's one that needs to be told. So my example, what really got me through what happened with me was the example that, was given to us in the Bible with Job. I think the book of Job is probably one of the most raw examples of how to acknowledge the Lord and to be patient and to suffer. I don't want to say but how to suffer and honor God through that suffering. And it's weird because, for the first 35 years of my life, I was a very active, fit individual. I had lived a very blessed life, is the best way to say it. And, while some bad things happened to me, it was nothing like what I experienced over the last year and a half. And it's funny because I've read the Bible many times, and the story of Job always stood out to me as something that I just intuitively connected with and was always kind of fascinated by, even though I had never been in a position like he had been in. I always wondered, why is this in the Bible, number one, and how can Job really conduct himself the way he did throughout that story? And anytime I would read it, I was just always drawn to it. And it's funny because when I got sick, one of the first things that Pastor John and I talked about was the story of Job. And so, in that very first chapter, in the first 2 verses, it talks about Job was a blameless, upright man. He walked in the ways of the Lord. He trusted God. He had a family. He was a wealthy businessman in a sense. He had servants. He owned pastures. He had a career. He had a family. He was doing very well in his life, and he was following God. And yet, the next things that happened to him were pretty crazy. And so just understanding that background right away, here's a successful person that loved the Lord with all his heart, and yet these things still happened to him. And, for us, it's a really good lesson and story about how to reconcile kind of the crazy things that happen in our lives. So in the first chapter of Job, the first test is really an emotional suffering and loss. So basically, what happens is the angels come before the Lord, and God is just speaking with them. He's like, have you guys seen Job? He's the greatest servant in all the land, and he's blameless, and he's an amazing man. And Satan basically is speaking with God and says, well, of course he's gonna honor you, and you answer all of his prayers, and nothing bad's really ever happened to him, but give him property loss. Like, what happens if he loses his family? Like, what happens if some bad, disastrous stuff starts happening to him? If you do that, I bet he'll change his tune. And so basically, these disasters and these events are cast on Job in the middle of this period of his life where things are going well, to where he basically loses all his property, he loses his family, he loses his servants who are working for him. He has close relationships with these individuals. And so the loss and the emotional pain and suffering that he felt at that period, really losing all of those people, and just why do all these really bad, horrible things happen to him? And so he loses everything. He loses his family. He loses his livestock. A big chunk of his business is taken out. I mean, he's just totally devastated. It's like basically losing your entire family and your job, and all in one day, like in an instant. That's what happens to him. And I imagine he had an emotional reaction. Obviously he probably had a lot of things to say, but it's interesting because at the end of the first chapter, all he really says is you got to take the good with the bad. Like the Lord, he allows good things and bad things happen. He's like, if I can't accept that, then who am I? And so in spite of this, he doesn't sin before the Lord, is how that chapter ends. And so the second test to me is very interesting because it hits very close to home with me. His second and final test was physical suffering. So again, as all the angels come before the Lord, the God basically says the same thing. He's like, look, Job went through all this hardship, and look, he's still blameless. He's not cursing me, and then finally Satan says, well, it's skin for skin. Let's cast some physical stuff on Job and let him work through that and make him feel it, I think is ultimately what that looks like. Physical suffering, for me, what happened was, the physical pain, it makes you forget. It makes you feel disconnected. It makes you feel unworthy. It makes you feel, it just gets to the bottom of your soul and how it makes you feel. There's nothing quite like it. And so Job was given sores all over his body, whether it was leprosy or, whatever those sores constituted. He had them all over his body, head to toe, and it was so bad that he took a piece of pottery and he scraped himself with it. And what that demonstrates is, and I've felt this way too through my condition, is you're in so much pain, you almost want a different type of pain to help you feel something different or get through it. Like for me, it was the headache. So it was like my headache would get so bad, I wanted somebody to come with a hammer and just hit me in the head to take the pain away. And so that's kind of what Job's reaction is. This is excruciating physical pain that he cannot escape. And it's likely 24/7. And the Bible doesn't tell us how long he suffered for, but it's probably at least a week, if not months. It really doesn't describe what that period was, but it was long enough. Any amount of physical pain for people that have been through it, that when you're in absolute pain, I mean, seconds or hours or years is eternity. And so that's where he's at in this sequence. And right at the beginning, his wife, in verse 9 of chapter 2, it says, do you remain firm in your integrity? Curse God and die. But he replied to her, you're talking like a foolish woman would. Are we to accept what is good from God, but not tragedy? So again, he is still fully engaged with his faith. He's not tuning it out. But for the next 38 chapters, and the book of Job is 42 chapters, for the next 38 chapters, he lays this case before God, and he complains, he just, he's starting to almost just lose it, and so that's where we're going to segue into my story, because the condition I had at the end of August of last year was jugular vein thrombosis. And we didn't know what that was for 5 months. So that's what my condition was that led to all the pathology and all my issues. But we didn't know what it was for 5 months, which is a long, long time. And so basically blood would just pool in my head and it would sit there all day long. And if you pumped any more blood into my head, if I did anything or any activity that increased the amount of blood that would go into my brain, it would just make it worse. So basically blood would pool on the left side of my head and it just couldn't drain out very fast, or at least it would drain out very, very slowly. And, some of you just hearing that, you might be like, well, what's that like? And just be curious. I personally, I think, I don't know that I can describe it really well, because I was telling John before this, it's almost like your body and your mind has a way of coping. It's almost like when I think about what I went through, like it wasn't real. So for me, it's like, did I really go through that? Was it really that bad? And I think it was. And I think for the people that saw me in that condition, they could speak to it better than I could, just because. So I just want to kind of talk about some of the things that happen, but also we'll talk about the amount of pain, just so to help some people understand. So kind of baseline pain was on the left side of my head. I had a 4 to 6 headache. So this is baseline. You do nothing, you start your day and hopefully end your day this way, and it's your baseline pain. So I had like a 4 to 6 headache, which is basically like, this is a really bad headache. I need to leave work. I can't think. I need to just get out of wherever I am and take some Advil or Motrin, whatever, to get this headache to go down. So that was the headache. And then my top row of teeth felt like they had cavities, all of them. So I was constantly like licking the top row of my teeth because I'm like, there's something wrong going on there. And there's so much pressure and pain in that area. And then my tongue, the left side of my tongue was on fire constantly and would go numb. But you didn't hardly notice that compared to the headache. And then my jaw hurt, and like I had just debilitating facial pain on the left side of my head, just as a baseline. So that's like 24/7, when you wake up. And then it just got worse. If you open your eyes, if you heard anything, if you breathe, if you started getting your breathing up, if you did anything, the pain would just get worse. And especially if I'm up walking around or doing anything functionally, it just got worse and worse and worse. So basically, by the time I woke up, being in that amount of pain, by about 12 or 1 o'clock, if I had done any activities or if I walked around, moved, got up to eat, it made it worse. And by 1 o'clock, I was basically ready to go to the ER. And I did a few times initially as we were kind of learning what was going on, because we didn't know what was happening. And so there's a lot that goes into that. But basically, long story short, from 1 week to the next, at the end of August, I was in bed 23 hours a day, every day. I couldn't hear sound. I really, any activity at all would just increase my pain. And the only way to cope with that was to lay in bed for 23 hours a day. And it almost just sounds ridiculous saying it now, like, really? Like, that's what was really going on? But it's true. And so there's a lot that goes into that when you're, in that type of pain, in bed all the time. And I guess I just want to kind of stop real quick and say I'm very thankful for everyone that supported me through this. My wife, number one, my mom, my family, John, the church, everybody that gave us food, that came over and listened to me when I'm sobbing and I'm losing my mind, and so many other people. I could spend all day just thanking everybody that came through for me, especially Hill City Church. And so what are some of the things that happen when you're laying in bed for 23 hours a day? There's a lot of things that go through your mind, obviously. And some days, it just get worse. I'd just be laying there at 1 or 2 o'clock, and I'm like, God, I gotta make it to 6 or 7 and just make it to being able to go to sleep. If I can sleep tonight, hopefully something doesn't happen that it spikes, the blood in my head, even though we didn't know. And like, hopefully my headache just doesn't get worse to where I'm just totally debilitated. There's so many things. I guess I'll share just one, probably the hardest one. My oldest daughter really understood what was happening throughout this process. She watched her dad was this, this 195 pound, strong guy. And then after a month and a half, I lost 40 pounds, and I'm basically turning into a skeleton in bed, and I can't get out and I can't get up. And she sees me 5-6 minutes a day, and I can't spend time with her. And my wife caught her in the backyard one day, and she was out raking, because it was in the fall, that September, right when it was initially happening. And she's like, Daddy does so much. It's like, how are we going to replace what Daddy does? And Daddy takes out the trash, and Daddy does this and that. And you don't realize, like, the impact you have on your children, kind of as an aside, as a father, going through something like that. And and I would never hurt my children in any way, and yet here's this event where I felt like I was hurting them, probably in the worst way possible by them literally watching me die, because that's what was happening. And probably the worst thing about it was every night before she would go to bed, she would come in and give me a hug, and Lindsay would she would come give me a hug, and then Lindsay would go put Aubrey to bed, and I'd hear every night, I would just hear, Aubrey, asking Lindsay, like, is Daddy gonna die? Is Daddy gonna die? And that was by far probably the that was the worst. And I'm glad I'm not just turning into a complete mess, because as I think about that, enduring that, and we talk about like just kind of the human experience and human condition, that's probably the worst feeling that somebody could ever have, is listening to your daughter say every night before you go to bed that you're gonna die. And I was at the place where I almost I couldn't stand it. I didn't want to hear it, because it's just sort of like you feel guilty and you feel like a failure, and there's all these sort of attacks on your mind that come with that, as you are putting your child through this. And it was just very, very difficult and very challenging, to kind of have to go through that. And that's just one of the things. And so, the other aspect of it was God was incredibly faithful throughout that entire period, because he would always send me someone to come talk to me on my worst days. It always seemed like people would show up on my worst days. We had the contractor who was doing some home renovations for us at the time, that come up and spoke to me and prayed over me. A lot of people from the church came and visited me, and it was very difficult, because when people would see me, it was hard. When you see somebody like that in that type of physical condition, it just has an impact on them. So I was very guarded with who could come and see and all of that, because I felt like I was sort of negatively impacting them, even though I wasn't. I needed them there. I was very much in need of their presence and just any social connection. And so that was a blessing, but it was also very challenging. I had my brother come over. He always came over on the worst nights. Like, there was one night he came over, I was basically just crying from like 4 to I think like 7 o'clock, and he came over and up after dinner, and I just, I was just talking to him and just complaining and like Job, right? Like, I wish I'd never been born, and why is this happening, and all of those things. And it was really, really a crazy time. But I think the story of Job and some conversations I had with John early on really established how to be able to get through something like that, which was acknowledging the sovereignty of God, that God had a plan for it. And it absolutely felt like that the whole time that I was sick, and while it was happening. And just knowing that God was going to use this situation, whether things ended up good or bad for me, for his kingdom. And it wasn't easy. There were times where it was very sad. Like, the whole situation was just sad, and there was no redeeming value, it seemed, to what was going on. But God was certainly at work while it was happening. And so, after about 4 months of this going on, I had my first surgery. And so the story kind of gets worse between my first and second surgeries, but it's a very important checkpoint. So on my first surgery, they basically found, after, I went to the doctors many, many, many times over the 4 months leading up to this, and they found a compression of my jugular vein due to my styloid. And the styloid process is basically a bone at the base of your skull that anchors the muscles that are coming up through your neck. And so mine was overgrown and had created a compression on my jugular vein, which isn't unusual. 4% of people have overgrown styloids, and then 4% actually have any symptoms or pathology from that, and they're usually not horrible. but the really bad cases were kind of like mine, but not nearly as bad, I would say. And so they figured that was the reason for the pathology. So I basically went in on December 11th. They performed the first surgery where they cut open my neck, went in, removed the styloid. And as they were removing it, they noticed that there was a blood clot that was just beyond the bottom of the styloid, beyond the blockage point. And they were like, whoa, we didn't expect this. All the scans and MRIs and stuff that I had before that didn't see the clot. And so they just felt like they had dodged a bullet. Because basically, lots of people, or some people, hopefully not a lot of people, have either seen somebody with a blood clot or dealt with it. You need to deal with it, very quickly, or you could have a pulmonary embolism or stroke or all these complications. And of course, mine was in my neck, so if it had broken off, it would have shot straight to my heart and I'd have a stroke or a heart attack or died instantly. Which, I'm very lucky that didn't happen over the 4 months, which really speaks to God's plan with it. But again, it was a very kind of crazy event that they would find something like that at the surgery and have not seen it beforehand. It was a miracle that they did. So after that first surgery, it was kind of funny because I think we did a video similar to this, John. It's kind of like a progress video to kind of say, hey, surgery was a success and all that, and it actually wasn't. So there's other things that went along with my surgery that I'm not going to speak to, that are sort of just background. But basically, the blood clot came back. And over the next 4 weeks after December 11th, I could tell things were not restoring. And my mom was actually catching me sleeping during the day pretty consistently. And like the pain and everything was still there. It was all still there, unfortunately. But I was actually starting to be able to sleep through it. And my mom wakes me up one day in the afternoon. She's like, you've been sleeping all day, you slept all night, you need to wake up. And I'm like, Mom, I just want to go back to sleep. Like, I just was tired, and like excessively tired. And what that was is my body was shutting down. Like it was starting to shut off. And so that really kind of freaked us out, obviously. And so we basically were telling the doctors, like, look, we got to figure this out, or we're going to the Mayo Clinic, or we're going off out of state to get this thing solved. And my doctor was like, no, it's 6 months to a year that you'll start feeling better and everything should be fine. And, you shouldn't be having any issues. Because I actually ended up reclotting in that vein, which is extremely rare. I had one of the best surgeons in the country that was pulling out my styloid, one of the best cardiovascular surgeons, in Colorado that were looking at this. I mean, people fly from all around the world to come see these individuals to get surgeries and things of the like. So it's pretty crazy when a doctor's telling you, you gotta wait a year. And I'm like, no, doc, we gotta check on this. So finally, after we sort of told him that we're going for a second opinion, they did an ultrasound after an MRI. They did an ultrasound of my neck, and they found another clot, which again, it reformed. So at this point, I think, the biggest takeaway at that point, and again, I just remember having conversations with John and my mom. At that point, with all the physical pain and everything that you're going through, I was over it in the sense that I was ready to die, and I was praying. I was praying every night. I was telling people that I'm like, I pray I don't wake up tomorrow. Like, just let me pass. I've lived a decent life. I love the Lord and I feel close to Him, and I've repented the things that I've needed to repent. There's nothing left for me to accomplish here. There's nothing more that I can do. And ultimately, if it's just on a Sunday or something, they wheel me in on a bed and I give a 10-minute spiel about my condition. They roll me out like that's it. And I accepted that was my life moving forward. And it's interesting because it's not that I fought that leading up to it, but I really felt that deep in my soul. and I felt so much comfort in just kind of giving up my life and saying that was it. There's nothing more to it, other than if I can glorify God on the Sundays by rolling me in. It is what it is, and that's the only time I'd sit here and say that I'm proud of myself for my faith in that moment. That in the worst moment, that's what I had decided to express. That's where I went. It wasn't to like any final pleasures or any like going sightseeing or it's like, no, I'm ready to be home with my Father, and I truly felt that way. But anyway, they found the clot in my neck, and so I had the second surgery, which is a whole long story. I basically was medically killed. One of the worst complications they could have, they had to go in and manually dig out the clot in my neck through access through my groin up through my venous system, my neck, and they ended up puncturing my neck and having to stop the surgery short. So it was a failure, but which is like we could talk about that for days and days and days, what that experience was like. It was a failure, but I actually ended up walking out of the hospital that night on my way to healing, because they had done enough before they failed in the surgery to actually do something positive that ended up removing the clot. So I basically went home, was on blood thinners, and it ended up draining out the clot over a couple months. So yeah, that was a pretty crazy experience, and if you guys are curious, you should ask me about it later. But I want to get back to really the focus of this story with the patience within that suffering. Is that there was one verse in the Bible that got me through the whole time, and it was on my heart constantly. I'd remind myself constantly, and it's Job chapter 6 verse 10. And it says, and Job says this, as he's going through, he says, "Then I would still have this consolation, my joy in unrelenting pain, that I had not denied the words of the Holy One." So no matter what happened with Job, he complained, he told God, "You know what, Lord, I wish I was never born. Why are you doing this? It'd be better if I just never existed." Like, even in that, it honored God. And he didn't use a word to curse God. He didn't deny God. He didn't, through a really horrible experience, he was able to connect on a deeper level with God. And really his plight and laying out his case was really a way of him gaining comfort in that relationship at that time through such a horrible situation. And so that verse is huge. And I would say hold on to that verse, because you're going to, hopefully you don't need it in the way that Job did or that I did. But no matter how bad it gets, you can express that. Just know that God is the keeper of everything, number one, but also of those emotions, those feelings, what we're going through. He understands it, and he's right there with us, even when we were complaining to him. Just huge. So even after that, after my surgery, I have rheumatoid arthritis. I was diagnosed with that a couple months ago. So my legs basically don't work is the best way to describe that. So we're working through that. I've changed my diet, some other stuff, so I had to be pretty patient with that because I'm an active guy and I want to get after it, but, that's just where I'm at. But again, like this concept of being patient is really just trusting God each and every day that, maybe tomorrow I'm going to wake up, it's not going to feel great still, but, God has a plan for it. Maybe, one day this will pass, and, but I'm still going to hold on to his truths and honor him as I'm going through it. I think that's really the biggest thing with the patience aspect. And a really good example of that is in Psalm 88. It talks about Haman. Haman was, again, very similar to Job in terms of his setup. He was basically a worship and choir leader, and he sang before kings, and I'm sure he did well for himself and had a family. And if you read that Psalm 88, and I'm just going to read some lines to you here, it's pretty shocking what he says. It starts out with, "O Lord, the God who saves me, by day I cry out, at night I cry before you. May my prayer come before you. Turn your ear to my cry." And as you're reading this and you read Psalms, there's a lot of kind of awesome Psalms in there. You're like, okay, this is kind of interesting, but it's starting out somewhat positive. But he says things like, "Indeed, my soul has had its fill of troubles, and my life has arrived at the grave. You have put me in the lowest pit, in dark places in the depths. And he says in verse 9, my eyesight grows dim from affliction. I call to you, Lord, every day. I spread out my hands to you. And then finally, the last verse, which, really he's using the strongest language. He says, you have distanced my loved ones and friends from me. My only friend is darkness. And he's saying this to God, right? And so you're like, this is a period of Haman's life that obviously he's going through some serious stuff. But again, it's an example of the patience stems from laying his case before God and trusting God that he's going to get him through it. And Charles Spurgeon has a really good commentary on that. He said, in this psalm, Haman makes a map of his life's history. He puts it down of all the dark places that he's been through. He mentions his sins, sorrows, hopes. And now, in a real prayer, he's laying his case before God. So again, patience and suffering is understanding who's in control. We can't, I really can't express that enough. Look, people have gone through some really crazy stuff over the last 2 years. Mental health issues, people in church, we've lost, a few people. People are grieving right now. People are suffering all over the world. It's not an easy time to be a human being right now for a lot of people, just being totally honest. But the truth is, end of the day, God's in control and we can trust him. And he gives us resources. Like anybody who's going through pain, going through really tough stuff, the church is going to run after you. We're going to cook meals for you and dinners. And thank you again for everybody who did that. God is going to run and he's going to use people to support us through it. And he's going to help us with the patience and endurance. And so really the key takeaways here, I think that nobody understands suffering and patience like God does. If you read the story of the Bible, the patience that God has with us and all the things that we've done to him, if anybody understands what patience is certainly him. And, for some of us, we look for the purpose with the suffering, right? It's like, well, what's the point of what Job went through? What's the point of what you went through, Phil? What's the point of, I lost this family member this year, and I just, what's the point of all these bad things that are happening? And really, I think, for me, speaking personally, it teaches us pure perseverance, and it makes us more impactful for the glory of God. Job, after everything had happened, it talks about how he was blessed and how he ended up doing greater things. But it's not just the material stuff, because it talks about that. But you think Job wanted $10 million as a consolation after everything he went through, losing his family, losing his property? No, he was probably wiser. When he spoke to people, he was more sincere, more genuine, and he could certainly be empathetic and relate to people that were going through struggles. And so for me, that's really the greater things for me right now, is within the youth ministry, all the people I've talked to that have similar issues or going through really crazy stuff, just being able to kind of share my story and just cry along with them or share with them through it, has made me more impactful for God's kingdom. Because end of the day, when I was laying in that bed, I didn't want anything other than to be in the presence and to be with God. And as I come out of such a crazy situation, I just want more people to experience that and to have that relationship. That's the reward, and that's doing greater things for me. So that's what that looks like. And that's just my interpretation of the outcomes, because again, Haman and Job had similar outcomes. They became greater within their walks of life as they were doing that, but greater because of their deepened relationship with God through such a terrible event. And it just prepares us to do greater things. So, with that, I hope you guys can take away some good things from my story. I'd love to share more with you. If you have questions, you can come ask me about it. I probably will talk your ear off. And I hope you were able to take something from this today and ultimately know that God is our rock and our foundation. And the greatest thing we can do is follow him.